Well, it's good to be with you all. Such an esteemed group. It's great to present this work to you, which is just heading off to the presses now. So it'll be coming out as a book next year. So it's a little kind of a book preview. I'm going to be talking about global psychological variation and developing some ideas to try to explain that variation. Many of you are probably familiar with this term, but I'm going to be using this term W.E.I.R.D. It's an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. It's not meant to be a criticism or a critique or to put anybody down. It's meant to be more as a consciousness-raising thing. Okay, so I first got interested in the 2000 aughts. And I arrived at the University of British Columbia. I departed the Department of Anthropology at Emory University, where I was a cultural anthropologist. And I joined the Psychology and Economics departments at UBC. And I encountered these two gentlemen, Steve Heine and Aurora Zion, two social and cultural psychologists. And sitting together over a series of lunches, we began to realize that in each of our own areas of expertise, that there was not only global variation in the psychological outcomes and experiments, but that the most commonly used subjects, these Western subjects, so these weird subjects, tended to be outliers. They tended to lie at the extreme end of the distribution. So that eventually, 4 years later, we put together this review paper, and we go through the available experimental and other kinds of behavioral data, showing that not only is there substantial global variation, but weird people tend to anchor the distribution on a number of different relevant psychological outcomes. So this means that a typical textbook in social psychology is actually a textbook in cultural psychology. It's a psychology of one particular group, or at least we don't have the evidence sufficient in many cases to say whether that's the case or not. Now, we also found that many psychologists have this notion that there are certain core or fundamental domains. So people will tell you about memory, attention, visual perception, spatial reasoning, but we could show you in this paper cross-cultural evidence suggesting that there's variation even in those core or fundamental domains. Now, this paper was successful in the sense that it at least got the word out. And in data that I'll show you today and other data that I won't even get to, it would allow me to double or even triple down on the original claims in this paper, that there's in fact even more variation than we suspected in this paper, and that it's important variation and matters in the world. Although within psychology, there's been almost no change in the use of these weird subjects. So we relied on a paper published in 2008, which showed that 96% of subjects in social psychology experiments came from 12% of the world's population, weird societies. And more recent studies of psych science, almost 10 years later, still show that that number is about 95%. In developmental psych journals, it's about 93%. A striking number of these papers don't even report the demographics. It's as if you have generic humans, and you don't need to know where they're from or where they grew up or anything like that. Okay, now that paper was in many ways unsatisfying because it was very much a methodological critique. There's a lot of interesting variation out there that needs explaining. So what I've been focused on for the last decade is trying to figure out how to explain that variation. How can we explain that? And the first question, is it in fact the case that these weird populations typically anchor the end of global distributions? Or an alternative, and there's lots of alternative possibilities, maybe it's that so many researchers are weird that they tend to pick interesting psychological domains that they turn out to be outliers on. I now think it's the former, that there are particular ways in which these weird populations are unusual. And just to give you 2 cents to begin to map the global variation, individualism is a measure used in social psychology. This particular one derives from a measure by the Dutch social psychologist Geert Hofstede. And it's a survey instrument which asks about people's aspirations and achievement orientations, some stuff on links to kinship. And if you map the whole world, you find out that there's a lot of interesting global variation. There's large swaths of terra incognito, psychological terra incognito. All the gray is where we don't have data. But then consistently you get the dark blue areas, which are the extreme end of individualism. The US is high, Australia is right next to them, and then the UK, and then other Western countries. And then if you looked at something like out-group versus in-group trust. So this is how much you trust people you met for the first time, foreigners or people from other religions, versus how much you trust members of your family, friends, or people you know. And you find a lot of variation there as well. And again, the certain set of countries there seem to be at the extreme end of the distribution, although there is lots of global distribution. So you don't want to set up a West versus rest dichotomy in your mind. There's continuous variation. Okay, now I point these two out just because they're economically relevant. So you can go to the literature in economics, and you would find that economists in leading journals have made the case that individualism causes, and I mean causes in the serious way, causes more innovation and faster economic growth. Now you might want to dispute how they were able to identify causality, and that's certainly sensible. The same thing has been done with trust, arguing that trust indeed causes faster economic growth. So these are economically relevant variables. And finally, I'm going to wrap this question up about the psychological variation with the core question really led to the discipline of economics. So this is Adam Smith's question in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. What explains the differences between the poverty and wealth of nations? And core to answering this question has to be answering the Industrial Revolution. So sometime after 1750, there was an explosion of innovations that erupted out of the English Midlands and eventually trundles across Europe and other European descent societies like the US and Australia. And you get this rapid rise in income, first in UK and the Netherlands, and then the rest of Europe, and eventually globalization is about the rest of the world following along on this pattern. So I think we can say something about this pattern, this massive economic expansion, by getting an understanding of the origins of this global psychological variation. And I'm going to be making the case that, in fact, this variation precedes this big economic explosion. So could there be a shift between the psychological shifts and the Industrial Revolution? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is give you the broadest of outlines of the idea that are developed in this book that comes out next year. And then I'm going to focus in on a few smaller areas, because you're quickly going to see that the idea is too large to possibly fit into one talk. But I want you to get a sense for the overall idea. Now, what we're trying to explain is a certain set of patterns. I'm going to call it weird psychology, or getting people to a weirder psychology. I've already given you two dimensions. One is individualism, and one is this trust in strangers. But I'm going to lay out a theory about what we should expect the domains to be, and then show you lots of data. So my story begins in an unlikely place. At least most people find it unlikely, most academics. In late antiquity, one particular branch of Christianity, not all of Christianity, one particular branch with the Western Church. This is the branch of Christianity that eventually evolves and becomes the Roman Catholic Church. Adopted what I'm going to call the marriage and family program. And this is a set of incest taboos and marriage regulations and rules about the family that dismantles the intensive and complex kinship groups that lots of European tribes had before the spread of the Western Church into Europe. So it dissolves these, he breaks all these families down into monogamous nuclear families. So by year 1000, parts of France, England, parts of Germany are already monogamous nuclear families, so 1,000 years ago. And then I'm going to try to persuade you of this link. So I have two kinds of links on this. The red links are historical data, and the green links are psychological data. And I'm going to tack back and forth between showing you historical data that seats us in a time and a place, and then test psychological theories, which is going to be the green ones. So the breaking of European kinship structures down into monogamous nuclear families from kindreds and clans and these other larger scale kinship formations led to the proliferation of what historians call voluntary associations. So you can find many historians that will go on and on about how unusual Europe was, and that they had all these groups that people would join voluntarily, that they had shared interests. There are guilds, they're called confraternities in some work. Monasteries begin proliferating like mad. Charter towns start popping up. This is a town where you join. You have to apply for membership. If they accept you, you take an oath before God, and you have certain responsibilities to your other town members. Universities are also voluntary associations. So they're either essentially professors' guilds, that's the Paris model, or there's the Bologna model, where the law students banded together to form the first university. Now, these voluntary associations begin competing fiercely for membership, and I make the case in the book that that intergroup competition has an effect on weird psychology. We're not going to get to that today. This led to rising urbanization. So people were increasingly moving into these urban confraternities and charter towns, and they began to engage in occupational choice. So they could freely pick occupations. You could join the Baker's Guild or the Clockmaker's Guild, and that's going to have an effect. And this led to the rise of impersonal markets. So you get this set of market norms that historians describe, where people began making contracts rather than relying on kinship relationships or having a clan span a trade route like we see in China. You began to have impersonal transactions, and that's going to have an effect. And then finally, I make the case that starting in the High Middle Ages is when you begin to see the rise of representative government, particular forms of laws that are focused on the individual, a concern with intentionality in law. So you don't see that in other places nearly as much. The rise of Protestantism, a deeply individualistic religion where each person has to read the Bible for themselves in order to get closer to God. That comes in 1517. And then innovation, financial markets, and economic growth. I'd be happy to talk more about that component of the talk later. Okay, so we're going to focus on this one, and then we're going to move to this one. So a historical link and a psychological link. And then hopefully later we'll get to these links. Okay, now to kind of give you the big framework here, I'm taking an evolutionary approach. And when I first started to write this book, I started writing this in 2010, 2011, and part one was meant to be the evolutionary foundation. So what's the framework we should be using to think about this big question? And just so you know, for those of you who haven't written a book, part one spins off into its own book. My publishers weren't very happy with that, but I had to let it go. And it became its own book. So here we're taking very fundamental evolutionary approach, thinking about the action of natural selection, shaping our minds, adapting our minds in specialized ways for survival, taking seriously the idea that we're the third chimpanzee, we're a kind of ape. But I'm particularly interested in these psychological mechanisms that allow us to learn from each other. So that suite of mechanisms that allow us to copy motor patterns or infer underlying mental states, to learn about tools and technologies and plants and all kinds of things like that, as well as lots of other aspects of psychology. So one of my other interests, for example, is status. So that would be something that would go in this box. Now, the existence of these mechanisms give rise in humans to a process of cultural evolution that we don't see in other species, cumulative cultural evolution. And that's going to lead to complex tools and ritual practices, social norms and institutions, and increasingly complex languages. And so what I want to focus on today to be able to build theories of cultural psychology is to think about how our minds adapt ontogenetically over developmental time to the culturally constructed world created by these increasingly complex tools, particular practices, norms and institutions, and languages, just to give some examples. So to give you a sense of the kinds of things I'm thinking about, something like visual processing could be affected. Our world is quite culturally constructed. If you look at this room, it's full of 90-degree carpentered corners. And you can make the case, and psychologists have, that in fact we have adapted ontogenetically to a world full of carpentered corners, and this leads us to see certain visual illusions that if you do the exact same experiment in the Kalahari among the Jungwazi, they don't see the illusion, but if you do it here, we do see the illusion. So this is ontogenetic adaptation to a world of carpentered corners. Same thing, some languages have different spatial coordinate systems, and if you do the same measures of how people understand space, you get different answers when they have different tools in their language that they've come to know over many years. So something as simple as right and left doesn't exist in every language, and it takes us a while to learn that, but then it's a new tool that we can use to organize space. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that these are biological differences. So when we go through this process, there's now more than enough evidence from neuroscience, from cultural neuroscience, to suggest that this process of ontogenetic adaptations modifies our brain. So one simple example is that learning to read thickens your corpus callosum. Reading only spread within the last few centuries, and we know when it started. It started with the Protestant Reformation in 1517 with a particular doctrine called sola scriptura. And then people became increasingly literate. So that thickened people's corpus callosum, leading to a biological but non-genetic change that spread throughout literate populations. So it's a kind of biological evolution, just not a kind of genetic evolution. Now, The Secret of Our Success, the previous book, also takes quite seriously this feedback loop. So these things create a world, and that then shapes our genetic evolution, which then feeds back and then leads to changes here. I'm not going to be emphasizing that today at all, but just to kind of complete the story. Right now, I'm going to zero in on norms and institutions, and we're going to look at the most fundamental of human institutions, probably the first human institution. So I'm going to call these kin-based institutions, and these are built on potent psychological anchors or psychological mechanisms, but they're actually a collection of norms that are kind of anchored on these. So social rules for which the violation of leads to some kind of sanction or other penalty. So the obvious one, and I think there's good evidence to believe that humans have a kin psychology. So we come into the world with a reliably developing mechanism that causes us to bestow benefits altruistically on those we share genealogical relatedness with. But human social norms have extended that. So in lots of small-scale societies, you'll find you have brother, people recognize that's your true brother, but then there'll be some other group of people you call brothers, and there'll be some different kind of cousin. And you'll be expected to behave to them in a brotherly way. Now, we have some evidence to suggest that simply doing that leads, having those terms and labels and growing up in a world where those exist, means you behave in a more brotherly way to those more distant cousins. Of course, no one's confused. People still, Marshall Solomons is not right about that. But there is a sense in which you may be harnessed to get more prosociality towards certain kinds of cousins. And you also are better able to learn the norms and expectations when you have this kin psychology. Another key part of kin-based institutions is pair bonding. So like gorillas, humans seem to have a specialized psychology for teaming up for the rearing of children. Human children require a lot of investment and a lot of input, and a pair bond is basically a trade of male investment for greater paternity certainty. Females can surrender varying degrees of paternity certainty. This is also important because marriage, by creating a set of social norms that's recognized by a community, creates links between children and their father's side of the family. So it dramatically expands the kinship network. Non-human apes don't have that advantage. And finally, incest aversion, important work done here at UCSB. We seem to have mechanisms for identifying relatives, and we're able to avoid them. We generate sexual disgust at the possibility of inbreeding. But cultural evolution has formed these into incest taboos. So in some societies, you have social norms which prescribe any kinds of sexual relations or sometimes even interaction with various kinds of cousins. And so this is going to profoundly shape the social networks that human societies face. And by manipulating these, you can make the networks more dense or make them more extensive and do a variety of things that I'll talk about. All right, so the evolution of human society. So until about 12,000 years ago, humans lived primarily in relatively mobile hunting and gathering bands, forming larger tribal social networks. But with the origins of agriculture and sedentary forms of life, you get a couple different pathways of societal evolution. So one is using kinship, adding more rules about marriage and residence that creates dense, embedded social networks. You get the emergence of unilineal clans, and that's when you forget half of your family and just focus on one side, either tracking descent through matrilines or patrilines. It eliminates conflicts of interests. Common ownership of land, for example, inherited status, ancestor worship are all patterns that go together. There's several different ways to continue scaling up above the clan: age sets, segmentary lineage systems, and simple chiefdoms. I'm not going to get into the details of each of these, but as far as we know, there's really only one pathway to get to pre-modern states, and it runs through simple chiefdoms to complex chiefdoms to states. And everything is a story of, everything is still based in kinship all the way up till you get to complex chiefdoms. In complex chiefdoms, you get stratification, where an elite stops intermarrying with lower classes, and then you can no longer trace relatedness to the chief or the chiefly clan. And then states build on that. So the evolution of political institutions is intermeshed with kinship systems until you get to this point. And there are other kinds of pathways which I won't mention just because this is the one that goes to states. Now, when you look at pre-modern states, they're still fundamentally embedded in kinship structures. So pre-modern states, you have the emergence of state institutions, so religious and military institutions that mediate between an elite strata and lower strata. But at both levels, you still have arranged marriages, a web of obligations, production rooted in kinship, social safety nets based on kinship, personal identity. So it's still kinship at the top and bottom. All right, now in the book I make the case that this creates a pathway that doesn't lead to contemporary states, to the kind of secular institutions, isolated nuclear families where the important institutions are not rooted in kinship. So the way to get around this is that is going to be that the Catholic Church is going to tear apart all this kinship structure and allow the system to rebuild itself unknowingly, accidentally. Now, to get into this, let me start by taking a note. So in pre-modern states, you had these complex forms of kinship at the elite and lower strata. But if we look at the kinship systems that most of us are familiar with, you're going to find they're rather unusual. So I call these weird kinship traits. And so bilateral descent, so tracking descent through both mom and dad, Most societies don't have it, so 72% of societies don't track it bilaterally. They track it either for one, other, matriline or patriline. Cousin marriage, 75% of societies have some sort of cousin marriage, either preferred or prescribed, or prescribed. Monogamous marriage, 85% of human societies in the ethnographic atlas allow men to take additional wives. Nuclear families, very rare. Only 92% of societies have nuclear families as the root. And neolocal residence, very rare. 95% of societies don't have it. So if you add these up, most societies in this ethnographic database don't have any of these weird traits. So this is 50.1%. And then it goes all the way down to here where you see very few have the 5. If you dig into all 5 of these kinship traits, you'll find that a bunch of them are European descent societies. So the Irish are in there, French Canadians are in there. And then there's some societies that were Christianized early. So in Cebu in the Philippines, Magellan starts complaining about polygyny and other practices as soon as he arrives in the Philippines. He also dies in the Philippines. And then in North America, you find that Spanish missionaries got there long before the anthropologists and had transformed the kinship structure. Okay, so families are a good place to start because it's where it starts developmentally. So it's the first human institution that we face when we came into the world, and was probably the first human institution that emerged as humans became cultural. Okay, so how did the European kinship system get this way? A first hypothesis that people often have is this is just a product of wealth. The people get wealthy and they start making monogamous nuclear. We know that's not true. So we have statistical data at 1500, which already shows this transformation is complete in lots of Europe. So that's long before the economic expansion. There's reason to believe, but I'll be giving you the evidence as we go along, that it was the church's marriage and family program. So the Catholic Church, but not other sections of Christianity, not the Coptic Church, not Assyrian Christianity, not the Chaldeans, had a series of incest taboos that expanded and began to prohibit sex and marriage to an expanding group of relatives. Blood relatives, but also affines, so in-laws, and spiritual kin. So, and we still see the heritage of this. So if you've been to a wedding presided over by a Catholic priest, there'll be a point in the ceremony, I think it's also true of other religions, when the priest will say, does anybody here have any objections to the union of this couple? If now, speak now or forever hold your peace. And there's a pregnant pause. At least the weddings I've been to, nobody objects. But that is in there. It was put in there under the Carolingian Empire as part of this inspection process, where they had all the relatives together. So if anybody knows these people are related, now's the time. And if you don't say so, it turns out you could be in trouble. You also got their land if you dimed them out. So there was also financial incentives. And the other place where this is so we have this expression for our affines in canon law. You don't find this in pre-Christian European languages. It changes. Because when we say she's my sister-in-law, we're saying she's my sister in canon law. And what that means is no sex or marriage with her. She's your sister. So you can see it's tapping the incest aversion. So that's in canon law. And so these are still remnants of the church's efforts. Of course, the church bans polygynous marriage, also prohibits sex slaves. No marriage by choice. So the church wants to end marriages, arranged marriages. This gives power to patriarchs, to clan leaders. And so in the ceremony, many of you are familiar with, the bride is asked, do you take this man to be your husband? I do. Very rare do women get to say I do, but the church put in this I do statement to make sure this is not an arranged marriage. Now, of course, no doubt many women said I do, even though they didn't. But it was baby steps. Okay, and the church also discouraged corporate ownership of land, and they tried to get it to be individual intestaments. So they wanted to strap land to individuals and have individuals own it. And the anthropologist Jack Goody argues that the reason they did this was because they wanted people to be able to bequest land to the church. So I'm on my deathbed, I'm rich, I want to get to heaven. There's a doctrine that you can get treasure in heaven, and so I could bequest my land, I could give my land to the poor through the church. But if I don't really own my land and my whole clan owns it, then I can't really give it away. So this spreads, and it's something the church is very much behind. And it's likely that this led to the dissolution of tribes because people increasingly had to find people to marry that were further away from them, but they could only marry fellow Christians. And tribes are maintained by endogamous rules of endogamous marriage. And so once you begin marrying outside tribal boundaries, you dissolve the tribal boundaries. Okay, so the church is going heavy on this by late antiquity, and by 1500 there's evidence that the European marriage pattern is in place, which is monogamous nuclear families and a series of other related traits. So to give you a sense of the theory that's in the background here, just think about this way. So we're adapting psychologically to these different worlds, these different social networks that have been constructed. So in a world of intensive kinship, most of your relationships you get by birth. And so those are the people you're going to work with. That's your social safety net. That's your identity. You might jointly own land. And so you need to conform to various roles and privileges that are described by your relationship. You're an older brother, you're a cross cousin, or you're a father. And this is the core of your identity. Over in this world, you just have a monogamous nuclear family. And you need to go out and find business partners and spouses and friends. And you need to cultivate a set of attributes that allows you to operate effectively on this market. In this world, a lot of your capital, your personal capital, is these family connections. So you strengthen those up. In this world, it's stuff that's attached to you, the person. You know, are you smart? Are you friendly? All those kinds of things. So here you're going to seek new relationships based on network connection. So if you need a business partner and you want one you can trust, you're going to look for someone who you have overlapping ties to, because you know the fact that you have those ties is going to make them trustworthy. In this world, you've got to try to figure out who's trustworthy and who's not. And you're going to be concerned with dispositions and attributes. And people are going to have incentives to show how trustworthy, though. Here, it's the connections can take care of that. So trust based on embeddedness, trust based on dispositions. This is a world of shame. So you're concerned about living up to all these obligations. This is a world of guilt. You have individual personal standards. Someone else might not have the same standards. You're cultivating your standards, and you experience guilt here. Shame is a human universal. I think the evidence is good on that. But guilt is an interesting, potentially cultural variable emotion. Identity derived from relationship and network. So again, it's this family, your name, your house, whereas here it's your cultivated personal self. Okay, so talk more about that as we go. Okay, simple, getting to the empirics now. The medieval church's policies altered the kin-based institutions in Europe and around the world eventually, and this leads to certain aspects of psychology. So I'm going to need to show you evidence here that longer exposure to the church leads to these certain kinds of kin-based institutions. These institutions also auto-explain aspects of this psychology, and we ought to be able to go directly. All right. So to do this, we tried to measure the intensity of kin-based institutions in two different ways. First, we went to the Ethnographic Atlas. So this is this compilation anthropological database put together by George Peter Murdoch in the 1960s. And there's a lot of interesting data in there on kinship. And anthropologists were obsessed with kinship for a good part of the 20th century. And I think the reason they were obsessed with it, having done work in places like Fiji, is because the people you study are obsessed with it. So your ethnography reflects what people are actually interested in. So anyway, we created this kinship intensity index, which puts together measures of cousin marriage and polygyny and the existence of clans and extended families into a single index. An economist named Ben Anke heard about this and developed a similar approach, although his index is somewhat different, but we get convergent results. So it's kind of a somewhat independent check. So here's this mapped across the world, 1,000 societies mapped to every ethno-linguistic group in the world. And this is the kinship intensity. The bluer areas have less kinship intensity, and the redder areas have more. We worry about this because these are just based on anthropological observations. It's coded. So, I mean, it is what it is. So we also gathered national level data on percentages of cousin marriage. This is put together by a biologist named Alan Biddles. And it's actual frequency, rates of second marriages to second cousins and closer. And so we can also map the world using that. Within Europe, you're going to see me use cousin marriage data based on dispensation requests. So Europeans were desperate to marry their cousins. The church said no. During the High Middle Ages, the church said, well, maybe you can, we'll let you pay for it. And so the church figured out a lot of ways to cash in on this. You can buy an annulment, you can buy lots of stuff. And so then we also developed this measure of the duration of the church exposure to the Catholic Church, to the Western Church, and the marriage and family program. Okay, so those are going to be our predictor variables. That's what we think's doing some of the work here. And for psychological measures, our predictions are going to be, based on the theory I gave you one slide on, is that greater church exposure, so more years under the Western Church, or less kinship intensity should predict greater individualism and independence, less conformity and obedience, greater impersonal prosociality. So this is the kind of stuff that behavioral economics things measure. So prosociality, cooperation with strangers, a less particularistic or relational morality, and greater use of intentionality in moral judgments. You're going to see a lot of different measures, so I'm going to show you some laboratory measurements. That gives us our best psychological measure. I'm going to show you surveys, not as good as laboratory experiments, but I got hundreds of thousands of observations. And then ecologically embedded measures, because I always worry that people say whatever on surveys, or maybe the lab experiments don't tell us about the real world. Okay, so here I'm going to be drawing on this recent paper in Science by Jonathan Schultz and colleagues, including myself. And so first I'm going to show you some cross-national analyses. Now I'm not going to make too much of these other than to say, look at the broad amount of psychological variation and that it's consistent with what we would expect from this theory. Then I'm going to zoom in on Europe, and I'm going to compare different regions within the same European country, and I'm going to find the same psychological patterns. Then we're going to look at second-generation immigrants, so people who grew up their entire lives in different European countries, but have parents that come from elsewhere. And we're going to see the same results there, and then we'll zoom in on Italy. Okay, so I showed you this previously, and this is centuries under the medieval Western Church, and the percentages of cousin marriage rates in different countries around the world. So more centuries under the medieval church, lower rates of cousin marriage across societies. And here we see that greater rates of cousin marriage, and this is an aggregate of all of our cross-national measures. So we scoured the literature, and we found 17 different measures that allowed us to test our hypotheses. I'm going to show you some of the individual ones. They all tell the same story, but if we compile them all together into a single component, a single factor, we called it we had to name it, individualistic impersonal psychology. This is the relationship you get. So if you want everything in one image. And then centuries under the medieval church and more of this individualistic impersonal psychology. Now you'll see here I have the Western Church. We also did the same thing for the Eastern Church. And this is a good test case because the Eastern Church had a kind of wimpy version of the Western Church's marriage and family program. They only ever went out to second cousins. They were kind of sluggish on enforcement. They didn't have the Carolingian Empire working with them. So you typically get weak results for the Eastern Church, but in the same kind of direction. Okay. So measures of individualism. So you saw this map before, and you get greater kinship intensity using the ethnographic atlas, less individualism, more cousin marriage. This is another way of measuring kinship intensity, and you get less individualism. Now here we have enough data. We can put in a bunch of control variables. So here are the control variables we use. You can put in ruggedness, mean distance to waterways, caloric suitability, so that's an agricultural measure, absolute latitude, tropical climate, pathogen stress, genetic heterogeneity, time since the Neolithic transition, irrigation potential of the land, religiosity, and religious denomination. So for example, if you only compare predominantly Catholic countries to other predominantly Catholic countries, you get the same result. So you can hold the denomination constant. All right, and here is the duration of years under the medieval church and individualism. And you can see strong relationship with the Western Church, weak relationship with the Eastern Church. Asch conformity test. If you took a basic course in social psychology, you know about the Asch conformity test. It's a measure of your tendency to go along with peers who are giving the same wrong answer. And when you do this by yourself, subjects typically get it right 97, 98% of the time. So here we have the percentage of errors that people make. So most of these errors are them just saying, I'm just going to do what those guys did. And what we find is in societies with higher kinship intensity, people make more of these errors. So they go along with the two peers more frequently. Same thing with cousin marriage, tells the same story. And more years under the church, less conformity. So this is nice because it's a laboratory experiment, classic measure of conformity, but there's not so many data points, so we can't control for all the other stuff. Now another kind of experiment to look at is the public goods game. So in this experiment, there are 4 players, and each of them are endowed with, say, $20. They can contribute any portion of the $20 to a common pot. Whatever goes in the common pot is increased here in this experiment by 40% and then divided equally amongst the group. In the experiment I'm about to show you, 10 rounds, all with the same people, all university students, all anonymous to each other, real money on the line. There's going to be two versions, one with and one without punishment. Straightforward game theory prediction is that income maximizers should give 0. We don't find that anywhere. And so this is Benedict Herman, Simon Gexter, and Christian Toney, published in Science in 2008. So we get their data, and we find that stronger kinship intensity means lower contributions in the first round of the experiment. Same thing with cousin marriage, and more centuries under the church, greater contributions in the first round. And you get the same kind of pattern. Here's the Eastern Church, and that's the Western Church. Now, I could show you other ways of cutting up this same data. The effects actually exaggerate if you add a punishment treatment. So in the punishment treatment, it's the same setup. People are playing multiple rounds of giving you this common pot, but you let players pay to punish. You actually get two different treatment effects. In places with low kinship intensity, the opportunity to punish drives payoffs up. In places with high kinship intensity, giving people a chance to punish drives total payoffs down. And the reason is when you get punished, if you're from a high kinship intensity, you get mad and you want to punish the guy back. Now it's anonymous, so players start punishing high cooperators, and you end up in this slug match where they're punishing each other back and forth. That drives the total payoffs down. So it's a case where the same treatment has divergent effects depending on the kinship intensity of the society. Okay, now I always worry about the behavioral economics games because they might not track the real world. So we looked around and we kind of think, what kind of data could we get that would be a real public good? So one is anonymous blood donations, voluntary anonymous blood donations. You're giving blood to a stranger. It has a cost to you, but everyone benefits if when you get injured, you go to the hospital and they have some blood to put in you. So it's a true public good. And what we find here is that greater kinship intensity means less voluntary blood donations. Cousin marriage tells the same story, and greater church exposure also tells the same story. So more blood donations in places with greater church exposure with a weakened effect in the Eastern Church. Here we have lots of data. This is WHO data. And so we can control for all this stuff, and the same basic result holds. So that's kind of the cross-national data for public goods. One more round of this kind of social data. So the impersonal honesty game. So this is research done by Jonathan Schultz in different societies, and it's a non-social game. It's a behavioral economics game. You come into this cubicle. You're told you need to roll this die twice and report the answer into this computer, and then you're paid according to a schedule that looks like this. So you can see you get more money, $5, $10, $15, $20, $25 at a 5, and then 0 if you get 6. So you can score this in different ways. It's all on the up and up. It's all anonymous is what I mean. So one way to do it is to look at the percentage of high claims. So these are claims of people saying they rolled a 3, 4, or 5. And Schultz and Gexter don't know what people actually rolled, but they do have statistics and probability. So they can say that we know in expectation only half of those rolls can be a 3, 4, or 5. So 50 is the benchmark. If everybody was honest, they'd be here. A good sanity check, everybody is not honest. So everybody lies. But the amount of lying varies, and it varies in proportion, or at least in this linear measure, with measures of national level corruption. So in countries that are more corrupt, people claim to get higher numbers than they actually get. You can see it's a pretty strong relationship. So this goes to ecological validity. And then we can use our kinship intensity measures to explain a lot of the variation in this impersonal dice game. And we get the same pattern of results that you've been seeing. Now again, we worried about these kind of artificial games. So we went to a cool paper by Ted Miguel and Ray Fishman, two economists. And diplomats and diplomatic delegations from around the world all descend on New York City. And 90% of diplomats live within 1 mile of the United Nations. And in the 1990s up to 2000, you had diplomatic immunity for parking violations. So you could park anywhere, get a ticket, and just throw it away. But the ticket gets recorded, and it gets measured whether you paid. So we can measure how often people didn't pay their parking tickets. And what we find is that diplomats from places with high kinship intensity got a lot of unpaid parking tickets. And this is, blocking Manhattan streets, parking in front of fire hydrants, all that kind of stuff. More cousin marriage, more parking tickets. Note, this is a log scale. So there's a lot more tickets. And the same pattern with centuries under the church. Biggest effect for the Western church, weaker effect for Eastern church. And again, we have lots of countries now, so we can put it through its paces with all those different control variables. So same basic set of results there. Okay, so that gives you kind of the broad world picture. Now we want to get into the nitty-gritty. So now we're just going to zero in and focus on Europe. So to measure the church intensity of different regions in Europe, we created a database. So we got the date and location, the GPS coordinates of bishoprics, every bishopric in Europe. And you can see, so here I'm starting in 500, and see some of these areas turn gray. That means that some power unfriendly to the Pope got a hold of that territory. And so those bishoprics don't count. And so you'll see that that happens a lot in southern Italy. Well, let's see, where do we start again? Okay, so 500, start. So some Islamic powers or Byzantium took over here. Muslims invade here. You lose those. You'll see Ireland doesn't have any bishoprics. It's Catholic, but it's Celtic Christianity. And Celtic Christianity doesn't have the marriage and family program. It's not until the Normans conquer Ireland that they get the marriage and family program. All right. So this is yet dosages. So this is how much church exposure you have in different parts of Europe. You can see Italy is distinct, Spain's distinct. There's Ireland, Scotland, and East. All right. So we go to the European Social Survey, and we pull measures of conformity and obedience, individualism and independence, impersonal fairness, and trust. These are survey questions. So just to give you an example, conformity, he or she wants to avoid doing anything people would say is wrong. And there's actually 4 questions on that we put together. Measures of individualism, so a person wants to make their own decisions, to be free and not depend on others. Do you think most people, for fairness, do you think most people would try to take advantage of you if you got the chance, or would they try to be fair? And the classic trust question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? So scale answer 0 to 10. So what we're able to do is we're able to take 200,000 people from 442 regions for which we have a measure of the amount of time underneath the church. And we use that exposure to the church to predict impersonal trust. So more time under the church, greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness. Same thing with individualism, independence, but less conformity and obedience. And what we do is we put in what's called fixed effects. So we hold the country constant, the average effect of the country. So we're comparing different regions within the same country, and the effect holds there. So none of what you're seeing here with this stuff has to do with GDP or national health care or any of that kind of stuff, because the countries are held constant. We also hold constant religion, so we only compare Protestants and Protestants, Catholic and Catholics. We measure the influence of Rome by using the map of Roman roads. We can include lots of demography. I won't go through it all, but we have measures of the presence of medieval universities, of monasteries, the Iron Curtain, whether you're inside or outside, Carolingian Empire. And importantly, we hold individual income and education constant. So we don't see any effects of that. Throughout this, we focus closely on whether wealth could be driving any of this, and we don't find any evidence of that. And we can also analyze this just using socialist Europe. So a part of Europe with a very different history from the West, and you get the same effect. Okay, now I could show you evidence linking the exposure to the Western Church to the frequency of cousin marriage in the 20th century. So we're able to get dispensation data that allows us to estimate the amount of cousin marriage in 68 regions in Europe, in Italy, Spain, France, and we also have data from Turkey. That's from a different source. But what's more interesting for this group is we can ask whether kinship intensity predicts the aspects of psychology that we expect. And what we find is that more prevalence of cousin marriage in Europe, so again, Italy, Spain, and France, and Turkey, you get less individualism in places with more cousin marriage. You get more conformity and obedience, less trust, and less impersonal fairness. All of these, except the individualism independent, holds if you just compare regions within the same country. So that's an important check, and 3 of them hold. This one, most of the variation is between the countries, so it doesn't hold up. Okay, so the same basic story explains stuff, differences within Europe. Finally, if you're not an economist, you might not be familiar with this trick. It seems to be developed independently by 3 different Italian women economists. So The trick here is to take, so you have a couple, they could be born in the same other country or a different other country. They migrate, they end up in a European country, they have children, and that child spends their whole life in that European country, and then they take the European Social Survey. And that's when we grab them, pull them out of the survey, and we then link them back to where their parents came from. So we have data on where their parents migrated from. We can link them through mom's country, dad's country. We can create an aggregate of the two. Or we can look at the languages spoken in the house and link them to a kinship intensity using that. And what we find, so we have 12,000 individuals, and we're only comparing people living in the same country, and because they come from different places. And we find the same patterns. So if they came from places with greater kinship intensity or less church exposure, you get less impersonal trust, less impersonal fairness, more conformity and obedience, and less individualism independence. So it's the same social survey that we've been using. All right, and here we can hold lots of demographics constant, geography, whether they're married, their level of education, their feelings of being discriminated against, their income, whether they're employed, their religiosity, and their religious denomination. And you get the same results. Okay, so that eliminates a lot of possible hypotheses, because these folks never experienced the actual institutions or the ecology of the places where their parents came from. They just grew up entirely in a new place, so you have to have some channel to explain that. Okay, finally, Italy. Italy's been a common enigma in the social sciences, because there seems to be a big difference between the kind of renaissance of northern Italy and differences in southern Italy. So this is a cousin marriage data. We have detailed cousin marriage data from 92 Italian provinces. And you can see in the south, there's lots of cousin marriage in the 20th century. In the north, much less. And this is voluntary blood donation. So this is an Italian blood organization. This isn't WHO data. It gives detailed provincial level. And what you can probably see from this is that places with low cousin marriage don't give much blood. That's different further north. So you can link cousin marriage to voluntary blood donations. You can also link it to measures of corruption. You can link it to less impersonal trust, measured as the loans from friends. So do you take loans from your friends, or do you go to a bank? Do you keep your wealth in cash, and do you use checks? So checks is often used as a measure of trust. If you don't like to use checks, then it means you don't trust, is the idea. So just to show you some of the scatters, more cousin marriage, fewer blood donations, and more cousin marriage, more wealth kept in cash. The idea that that's more secure than financial instruments or this kind of thing. And here we can use lots of fun controls. So schooling, there's 22 Italian regions. We can hold those constant. We can use individual level measures of income, wealth, and education. And the same results come through. Right, that's that. Okay, so what I've been doing is, first I showed you some evidence here that there's a lot of activity by the church dismantling these. We can talk about more evidence if you're interested. And then I showed you evidence of this link. Now, just in a couple of slides here, I'm going to show you some evidence that there was growing urbanization leading to impersonal markets, and then look at some data connecting impersonal markets and participation in them to aspects of weird psychology. Okay, so this is data from urbanization in Europe. So 800, Europe was very unurbanized. Most people did not live in towns. So these are towns greater than 10,000. China is steady through this whole period at about 4%. So Europe passes China around 1,200. People are migrating as individuals, which is mostly people migrate to cities and they form clan barrios in other parts of the world. But they're migrating to these towns as individuals. And what you have, this is data just from the German lands, but you have a growing number of city incorporations. So new towns are starting, and they're adopting charters that they're copying from more successful towns. And they're granting markets. So these are grants to hold weekly markets. So every week we all sell our wares, merchants come, we all collect in the town at the same time, we do business, and then we go back to our farms or towns. So this definitely looks like increasing market integration, increasing urbanization. Now, there's a lot of evidence I could point to suggesting a link between participation in markets, market integration, and measures of impersonal prosociality. So things like fairness in an ultimatum game or in a dictator game. But that's just a correlation. So this study from Devish Rushtagi, I think, goes the closest to a causal relationship that I've been able to find. So Devish went to Ethiopia, and he worked with the Bale Oromo on the northern slope of the Bale Mountains. So this is one ethnic group. They're pastoralists. They live in patrilineal clans, and they have age sets. If you don't know what an age set is, don't worry. And so he studied 53 communities, and he did a simple two-person public goods game. So two individuals have a chance to contribute to a group project. Whatever they contribute is increased and then divided equally amongst the group. And he derived from this a propensity for conditional cooperation. So given that the other guy contributes, how much are you willing to contribute? And it's a one-shot game with an anonymous other person. And what he finds is that when you're far from the market, you have a long travel to the weekly markets that the town has, you are not very conditionally cooperative. You're mostly selfish. You just keep your money and don't give to the group. As you get closer to the market town, within 1 hour, 30 minutes right there, you're more conditionally cooperative. And the cool thing about this study is that the people were settled on their lands and they had customary land tenure to those lands before the markets were set up. And the markets were set up for reasons that had nothing to do with the distribution of this population. It had to do with another kind of invading group. So the markets are placed for reasons that don't have to do with these populations. And that allows us, at least tentatively, an inference that proximity to the market is causing greater prosociality. W.E.I.R.D can put in lots of controls for ecology and other kinds of things, and this preserves. Now, one of the important things about W.E.I.R.'s study is that he shows not only can he link markets and impersonal prosociality, but there's a conservation project occurring at the time. And he's able to show that places that have higher impersonal prosociality, more of this conditional cooperation, people are better at forming cooperatives. They form cooperatives to conserve the forest. And he has an objective measure of how much they conserve the forest, because you can measure the thickness of the trees. And the better the people are doing at monitoring and controlling use of the forest, the thicker the trees are. And so he's able to connect all these dots, suggesting that if you're able to shift people's psychology, you can make more of these voluntary associations to enforce public goods rules. Now, this is interesting and an important finding. Now I'm tacking back to history. And we can go to 14th century England, where economic historians tell us that most people in England live within 2 hours of a market, and 90% lived within 3 hours of a market, because markets had proliferated like mad through Europe. And that means that all of England is this part of the graph. So they're going to be more susceptible to building voluntary associations with impartial rules. Okay, and the last bit would be, if I had time, I would tell you about observers in the pre-industrial period who report the same thing. So Adam Smith and David Hume are particularly interesting. So Scottish Enlightenment. And Scotland is interesting. It's this small bit of land, but it's got hunter-gatherers in the north. It's got pastoralists, horticulturalists in the middle. And it has the heartland of the Industrial Revolution. James Watt is right nearby making the steam engine right around this time. And so they can see all this. And they make the same claim that markets have a gentrifying effect or a taming effect. It gets men to behave better is what the way they say it. And I mean, Smith actually has a kind of story about, if you're a merchant or a market, you got to maintain a good reputation. And so you don't want to give anyone a reason not to come to your store. So this is consistent with the account that I give, actually. Okay, now I've just showed you a few pieces of this psychological iceberg. It's actually much thicker. So I could show you similar evidence for the universalistic moral foundations. So here I'm thinking of John Haidt's work. You can partition his foundations into basically two broad categories. And you can explain that using the data, the same approach I've given here. Analytic versus holistic thinking. Do you think in terms of gestalt similarity or in terms of clear and distinct categories? That seems to be strongly correlated with the same kinds of effects up here. The importance of guilt over shame, use of intentionality and moral judgments, and at least some of the heuristics and biases that you see in the heuristics biases literature in psychology. So something like the endowment effect, if you were to read Thinking Fast and Slow, you would think that's a feature of human minds. But if you do it among the Hadza hunter-gatherers who still live in a traditional lifestyle, there's no endowment effect. It's not until you get to the market-integrated Hadza that you see an endowment effect. Personality structure. So I showed you data that urbanization is increasing and the number of occupational social niches are proliferating as groups grow. And here I draw on work from this university on personality structure, showing how greater urbanization leads to a proliferation of different personality dimensions. And then finally, you can tell a similar story with patients. Okay, so take-home messages. So I've tried to give you a specific case tackling this particular aspects of psychology, trying to explain this pattern that my colleagues and I found about 10 years ago. And the argument here is that it began with a set of religious taboos and prescriptions that one particular religion happened to place on the European populations that it was missionizing. And this transformed the families in ways that altered people's psychology, but then had cascading effects on voluntary associations, competition amongst voluntary associations, urbanization, and so on. It's interesting to think about what other religions were doing at this time. And what you can see is just, sort of what I think of as unintentional experimentation. So you have Western Christianity doing this. Over in Persia, Zoroastrians are encouraging cousin marriage, and even at the elite levels, they're promoting sibling marriage. So they've gone a completely different direction. Islam is saying, well, you can't marry 12 wives, but 4 are okay. And you have to let daughters inherit half of what sons inherit, which means if you're an agriculturalist and you have land, every time you marry off a daughter, if you marry to another clan, land is leaving your group. So you marry her to her father's brother's son, and then the land stays in the group. So you find this really strange thing in Islamic societies of parallel cousin marriage, which is almost unheard of in the anthropological record, except in Islamic societies. And so that's going to restructure the social networks, maybe with downstream implications. Now, the broader picture is that I think we need to be thinking about psychology, economics, and history kind of in a more synthetic way. So we need to think about cultural evolutionary psychology. So here the idea is that psychology changes non-genetically over time as people's minds respond to the institutions they face, the incentive structures created by the kinds of things I've been talking about. Institutions, language, technology. All right. So just as a side point, I've really found that, having now been in an anthropology department, economics department, psychology department, and now human evolutionary biology, is that when I'm doing this, disciplines are just getting in my way. Because I need data from all these different places, and every discipline has its own issues and hang-ups and stuff like that. So I've just found that disciplines are a problem here. So what we want to do is build a vertically integrated psychological and behavioral sciences that freely incorporates the ideas, methods, and tools from other disciplines under a broad evolutionary framework that takes seriously that we're a cultural species, but also that we have an evolved psychology that's going to have lots of implications for the kinds of institutions that emerge. All right, that's it.